Quality in the media, I think, has been something that's been with us always. We've always wanted to have good quality. We've always wanted to learn something from what we read and be entertained and have a real connection to it. And there's so much more media now that there's much more possibility for that. But along with that, there's also more possibility for fraud. And so it's a much more difficult and complicated media landscape. Freedom of the press has always been an interesting issue, and it's never been more free than since Thomas Jefferson said when he was before he was elected as a politician, he said, if I had a choice between government with no press and a press with no government, I would surely choose the latter. And he believed that when he said it, and then he later was elected president, and he tried to control the press quite a great deal then. But the press wasn't having anything to do with it. Like the press was free at that point, and properly so. They covered him aggressively, and he didn't like it, but that's the relationship between the press and the government. And that kind of relationship worked because for hundreds of years, that relationship really worked because we had a sense that we knew what we were reading based a little bit on the medium that we read it in. So if we read it in an old established newspaper, you had a sense that there was some process that information went through. And if you see it on TV, it's a different medium, it has a different sense. If you get a pamphlet handed to you by a guy at a park, you know not to take it too seriously because it's just a pamphlet handed to you by a guy. It doesn't mean you don't read it, it just means that you take that all into consideration. So it's all a part of the way that the freedom of the press has worked. It's always been a little bit at odds with government, and that's been good. I think the one thing that's actually changed, the one thing that's actually different in the last couple of years is the effects of the social networks, the effects of companies like Facebook and Twitter. And the reason is what I call a meat grinder. It used to be that you would read the New York Times and you would read Le Monde and you would read big papers. You knew what they were about. You knew what you were reading. But now all of the papers all get thrown into the meat grinder and turned into your social feed on Facebook. And so it's very hard for anyone who has a Facebook feed to tell the difference between you know, the Times of London and your crazy uncle that lives out in the village, because they all get sort of mashed in together. And so because of that, it's very important that we work hard to try to find who are the legitimate sources of news without squelching, without canceling out, without keeping new entrants from coming in, because we want new people. We always want to hear new voices. But there are people that try to take advantage of us, and they try to take advantage of the good reputation that journalists have built up over hundreds of years, and they take advantage of that good reputation for their own means. And sometimes those means are political, and sometimes it's just to try to make a couple of cents on some fraudulent advertisement. And so the goal is, how do we keep those guys out while still encouraging new voices? And that's a very tricky balance, but it's something that we definitely need to keep working on. I think that there is a movement that is coming to try to fix this problem. You know, we can call it the meat grinder problem. We've got this problem of all this different media going in, and then it comes out and it looks the same. And I think a solution that's starting to really gather steam is the idea of standards. The idea that we can set up and we can say, let's together as journalists come together and say, what is it that it takes to be called actually a journalist? And there are things that you can identify that don't have to do with truth or something not being true, but just things like you are who you say you are, that there's some transparency of ownership, that you have some sort of editorial control, so that if you do make a mistake, you have some way of correcting it. Because you know, we all make mistakes. Journalists have made mistakes forever. The question isn't, will you make a mistake? The question is, do you have some way to correct it? Because if you're publishing something that you know to be false, you're not going to correct it. And so the idea of standards has really caught on. And so we see a number of efforts around the world that are trying to bring standards in a regular and serious way to journalism, just in the same way that they are in just about every other industry. You know, the water that we drink, the ability to plug something into an electrical outlet, those are all safe because of standards. but not just standards, certification of the standards and the governance over the system of certification and standards. That's what works in every other industry. You know, because of Thomas Jefferson and because of freedom of the press, we've never had that with the media. But because we have a different problem now than we've ever had in the history of the media, it's time for a different solution. And so what I've been saying is that we need to take these great standards efforts that are from all of these different journalistic operations and then raise them up by having a certification system that will say, yes, this publisher actually does belong to this journalism operation, and they have checked to make sure that they're following the standards. And we can gather that up and verify that that's actually the case, and then certify that, and then share those certification results with the social networks, with advertisers who are very interested in this topic, with researchers, with others that are interested to make sure that they know who is and who isn't a legitimate journalist. So that's the solution that I'm working on at the Certified Content Coalition. Right, right, yeah. The question that goes back, whenever you have a certification or a standards body, there's a question that goes back to science fiction. Who watches the watchers? And it's a very legitimate question. I think that it's a bad idea to have a for-profit company doing that sort of work, because you never know what their motives are and what they're going to do to try to further their goals as a for-profit company. So I think any effort should be a nonprofit or a non-governmental organization. And then the other part of that is just it needs to have good buy-in from lots of different places. So you can't just have one company come up with standards for an entire industry. You need the industry coming together, and preferably in this case, you need lots of industry coming together. You need advertisers, you need publishers, you need non-governmental organizations and other standards bodies, technology companies. You need all of them coming together in a very transparent way in a nonprofit structure to be able to say, yes, these are the rules, and we think that these are the rules that are the base level, and then any journalistic operation that wants to use those base rules can use those. If they want to add other rules on top, that's terrific, but that's not the job of the certifier. That's the job of each individual place. So, you know, one certification authority in journalism may say, you know what, it's very important to us that you have diversity in your newsroom. And that's a standard that we have. And that's terrific. Our operation, the Certified Content Coalition, wouldn't certify that, but there are probably lots of journalism organizations that would want to be part of that because they believe in that as an ideal. So that's terrific in a place like the United States or in Europe, but there may be other places in the world where that's not as much of a factor, and so we don't want to limit the US-centric point of view to an operation that's going on somewhere overseas. So my background is in journalism. I went to journalism school and I worked as a journalist, and then I was a startup guy. I started 3 different companies, and all were successful. And I've decided to work with a group called Cable Labs out of Colorado that is already a collaborative body. They do research for the cable and broadband industry, and they belong to 27 different standard-setting bodies. And so they really helped me to understand how important the idea of standards are in the industry. And so it was kind of a nice bringing together of my background in journalism and the idea of standards and bringing them together. And so the CCC, the Certified Content Coalition, is exactly that. It's following the regular processes of standards, but really doing it with a journalistic mindset so that there's no problems with freedom of speech. There's no problem with the ways, you know, newsrooms face such difficulties these days, and it was very important to me to come up with a solution that doesn't add a burden to the newsrooms. I see a lot of different solutions that would ask reporters and editors to do even more work, and they're so overworked as they are that I really wanted to come up with something that wouldn't be a burden on the newsroom, but would follow the best ideas of standards and bring those together. So that's what the CCC is. Yeah, there's always a fear that whenever you have some operation that says this is something that's valid and certified and this is something that's not, that you're going to hold out something not that actually should be in there. And there's no easy answer to that, except for having a good, clear, transparent structure so that when you have a problem like that, there's a proper channel that somebody can say, make the case that something was improperly certified, improperly not certified, and that there's some way to review that and talk about that in a way that's transparent and understandable. And then once you've had that conversation, those errors can be fixed. There's never a perfect system, but if you have a system that allows it to correct as it moves along, then you're going to be able to get to where everybody's comfortable with it. There are lots of efforts out there to try to fight misinformation, and I'm a big fan of nearly all of them. And in fact, I keep one of the most comprehensive lists of the different efforts. I've got about 100 on my list, and I'm happy to share that with anybody that wants to look. There's a link to it on the website. I haven't seen something that has all of the elements that we're looking for. In fact, when I started out in this, I started out not thinking that I wanted to start something, but that we wanted to join something. We wanted to join something that was doing what we were doing. So we came up with a list of 7 criteria, and we said, let's find something that does all of these things. It can't be a burden on the newsroom. It has to work globally, has to work well with advertisers. And we came up with that list. And we looked and looked. We couldn't find anybody that met all 7 criteria. So we decided to start it based on that. But one of the other reasons we wanted to start it is we saw lots of great efforts out there. But the problem is with some of these efforts to bring standards to news is that they can be gamed. That there could be malicious actors that take advantage of a system that's trying to do some good, and a malicious actor could take advantage of that. And so my goal was to lift those organizations up and prevent that sort of fraud by saying, we're going to certify who the members are of these organizations. So if somebody tries to pretend they're a member of the organization and they're not, we would be the ones to catch that and report that to the social networks, report that to the advertisers, so that there wouldn't be any advantage in trying to take advantage of the good name of a good journalistic operation.